Good evening. Welcome once again to the Tzemach Bible Institute program. I'm John Klein, and with me this evening, as always, is Ken Garrison, pastor of Fellowship Church and founder of the Tzemach Bible Institute. Good evening, Ken.
Good evening, John.
Ken, tonight's question is, if the Six-Day War of 41 years ago, 1967, was a miracle of biblical proportions, why has our government been working so diligently to nullify it?
John, I think most people would find it hard to believe that that actually is the case, but we're going to attempt to demonstrate tonight just that is exactly the case, and look at the reasons why. So we want to look at that and look at the point that we believe that God is fulfilling prophecy on a daily basis, and it's more apparent probably in Israel than anywhere else in the world. Actually, obviously, people are getting healed and saved all over the world, so God is at work everywhere in that regard, but it really is apparent in the land of Israel. And so we want to kind of look at that and investigate why that's the case. We want to start by looking at the prophecy, or a prophecy, spoken through the prophet Isaiah. John, if you'd read that from Isaiah 10.
Okay, I'm going to read this prophecy, but we need to realize that every day in Israel, prophecies are being fulfilled.
Absolutely.
Growing. We're looking at Isaiah 10, verse 20. Now will come about that day that the remnant of Israel and those of the house of Jacob who have escaped will never again rely on the one who struck them, but will truly rely on the Lord, the Holy One of Israel. A remnant will return, the remnant of Jacob, to the mighty God. For though your people, O Israel, may be like the sand of the sea, only a remnant within them will return.
So just the fact that Israelis are continually gathering into the land in itself is a fulfillment of prophecy.
And we've become to learn that a remnant of that remnant are full of faith. Now, Israelis, and I have a lot of family that live in Israel, they are not believing the scriptures per se, but they have returned to the land, so they're fulfilling prophecy.
Absolutely.
But this remnant that we speak of, that you've seen here on this program, are full of faith and have moved to Judea and Samaria, these neighborhoods that were liberated in that Six-Day War, and they're a group that are there by faith, not just grabbing land, but liberating land that belonged to their forefathers.
Sometimes it's a little difficult for Christians to fathom that so-called, I used to use the term, I quit using it, unbelieving Jews, because that's not what they are. They're believing. Could be so full of faith, but certainly that is the case. Indeed, for the past 2 weeks, I have spent time in one of those communities, Kedemim, in the Shamron. It's the oldest community in the modern ingathering in the Samaria, or the Shamron, north of Jerusalem. And I brought 24 others with me up there a couple of weeks ago, and we've been working by our hands in the land, building, and we've mingled our sweat and some blood and tears into working the land. And we've been engaged in building a park area, a recreational area on a mountainside adjacent to the community of Kedemim. And so the Lord really truly blessed us. This indeed is the third year that our group has gone up there and worked and built this site, and it's become a regional center, a draw from all the surrounding areas. So we went up and worked in the land, put our sweat and again tears sometimes into the working of the land, and it was a great privilege for me to do so, and a great blessing. Now you might ask, why would we do such a thing? We believe that it is our responsibilities to encourage or strengthen this John spoke of a remnant, a people of faith, and so we believe it is our responsibility to encourage them. Now, the Apostle Paul, writing of all things to the church of Rome, specifically commands the church to do this. Read that from Romans 15, if you would, John.
All right, I'm in verse 8. For I say that Messiah has become a servant to the circumcision on behalf of the truth of God, to confirm the promises given to their fathers. So the Messiah, now as he is, so we in the world. So this is, 30, 40 years after the resurrection when Paul wrote this. So he's talking about the body of Messiah then, the body of Christ, to confirm the promises God made to their fathers. What are the promises? By the time Paul wrote this, was that the house of Jacob's going to return and rebuild the hills, and
that's precisely what we see. The other day, I stood with a group on the mountain above Shechem and looked at the valley coming up from the Jordan River, and you could see almost Abraham and his families and flocks coming through there, and maybe 60 or 70 years later, I don't know the exact time frame right now, didn't calculate it, but Jacob returning from Laban's house with his flocks coming through there, and it was incredible to see, to stand in the site where that biblical event took place, and in that same site today, Israelis are building, and we're helping them.
And not only that, you look over, you see Mount Gerizim, Mount Ebal, all of that is right there. The heart of biblical Israel, the heartland, Ken.
Absolutely.
Not stealing land from Arabs, but the heart of biblical Israel. And it's important, as Ken said, to have our own personal involvement. In 1978, actually, the Lord spoke to fellowship to identify with Israel. By 1980, we had progressed. We were sending a check, a tithe of everything that came in.
There wasn't a very big check either, but we
sent a very big check, but we were sending it to the Israeli government. We didn't really know where to send it. By 1984, we made our first trip into Judea. We went to Tekoa, the birthplace of Amos the prophet, and helped build a playground for the children there, donated money only. By 1992, now we had been tithing the full time to Israel, to different projects. By 1992, we really started in the settlement movement in Judea and Samaria, seriously, the Temple Mount. And as Ken said, 3 years ago, the first group went up to work. And so this is the third year. We've been actually working in the land, building in the land. And so we started off small, not knowing what to do. God led us to do this. We're not sure what we'll be doing 20 years from now, Ken.
That's right.
We might be living there. Who knows?
Since you brought that point up, John, let me just make a comment there. I believe, and now we're doing a type of program here that I believe is shining light and truth in this nation. And at this point in time, the community of the United States generally receives that, or at least doesn't totally reject it. I don't believe that my work is in Israel, really. My true work is here. But there may come a day when we would not be allowed to speak truth and light like we're doing currently. And if that's the case, there's only one place to retreat to. And so I've been looking around, looking around for a place. It's important. John spoke it. Let me say it again. It's important for believers to get their hands in the soil of the land of Israel, because this is the center of what God is moving and doing today. And it's very, very important that we ourselves and our faith are interwoven in that process. Now we want to look. John referred to this at the very when we started the program, but we want to look at the 6-day war, because we believe, and there's every evidence to indicate, that the 6-day war was a true watershed event in history. And we want to look at that and what happened then, and how God intervened and the result of that in various communities that would lead us to the type of involvement that John just got through sharing about.
Okay, so let's talk about the Six-Day War a second. And when we get into, I guess, the spring of 1967, we see that President of the United Arab Republic, Egypt, and was leading a rebellion, chased out UN troops from the Sinai, and was massing troops on Israel's border, along with Syria and Lebanon, and so an attack was imminent. Blocked Israeli traffic through the Suez and up the Red Sea. Anyway, Israel was locked in, and that caused Israel to attack in a preemptive strike. And it was so tremendous and so fantastic, and that's why we believe it's of biblical proportions, a miracle, just like other miracles that happen in the Bible with God's people in the land of Israel, that they defeated this combined, overwhelming Arab army in 6 days, Ken, and that's the Six-Day War, the 67 War, which is a miraculous victory for Israel.
I don't think there's any question that everybody receives it as a supernatural event, but it is especially received that way by the Israelis. Now, as John said, they took Jerusalem, Judea, and Samaria, and they did it in such a short period of time that the nations didn't have time to intervene and stop them. And certainly, if the nations, and I'm speaking of the United States primarily, but the nations of the world, the United Nations, whatever, they would have stopped them if they could have. But they didn't. Now, I want to speak about the revelation that occurred with the Six-Day War. Now, I'm going to be speaking now in terms of the testimony of Israelis. We'll look at the impact on both Israel, Christians, and the nations in general.
Now, you just spent 2 weeks living in the home of Israelis, and a group of 25 from fellowship with you, so they were interacting, and what you're talking about is not theory.
No.
You interacted with these Israelis living on the hills in Samaria.
These people. Now, you mentioned the project in Kedemim. I first went to Kedemim in 1984 and met the leader of that community at that time, and it was a relatively new community, and I was utterly amazed
and
at
she's
the
been
faith.
On this program, Daniela Weiss, a
Weiss.
couple of times.
I was utterly amazed at the evidence of great faith. Well, now that stemmed from the Six-Day War. Now I want to share a couple of testimonies. Before going there in 1984, in 1983, I knew an Israeli professor, actually, that was here in town, and he was doing a year's research work with the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and I got to know him, and his name was Shimshon ben Yehoshua. And Shimshon, now he knew me as a man of faith, because I'd been a born-again believer for a number of years and a pastor for several years.
Was introduced by a mutual friend.
Yeah, and so Shimshon would always say, Ken, you've got revelation. He'd say, I don't have revelation, but you. Now, when he said revelation, he meant evidence of personal interaction of God in their lives. That's really what he meant. I visited him in 1984. In fact, he's the one that took me to Kedemim, and he said, now he said, Ken, I know a lady in this community up in the mountains, and she's like you. She's got revelation. And he took me and introduced me to Daniela Weiss. But then one day, Shimshon said, well, he said, there's one day I did have revelation. He said, I was a part of a unit in the Sinai during the Six-Day War, and word came down the line that we had taken Jerusalem. The Temple Mount is ours. And he said it was the strangest experience that he'd ever had in his life, a singular moment, that it was as if he was transposed somehow to the Temple Mount himself. Now, I will share that because last week, we took off a day from the work that you've seen pictures that we were doing, and we had a guide that took us in the areas around Shechem. You mentioned Mount Gerizim, Mount Ebal, that whole area, and this guide was spectacular. But along the way, he was sharing about his own experience, and he obviously was a man full of faith. And so we were standing there at a given site. He was explaining things, and he got to talking about the 6-Day War. And he said, you know, I was in a military unit in the Sinai during the 6-Day War. And he said, you know, it was strange. Word came down the line that Jerusalem was ours.
So he had the same, this spiritual phenomenon that happened in the Sinai happened to Israeli soldiers.
Same experience.
Right.
Now, we have heard that same testimony by many. You know, the Wallmans, they were stirred to go to Hebron. I mean, God intervened in an awesome way in the very personal lives of these Israelis. Now, from a Christian perspective, we think, hey, this is not supposed to happen somehow outside of Jesus. But it did happen. Mm-hmm. It has happened. And we're witness to that. We've seen it. And this same individual was sharing. He said, you know, one of the interesting things today is some of the very well-known liberal writers in Israel today, elite intellectuals. He said they're embarrassed by what they themselves wrote right following the 6-Day War because they were writing words of faith, because God intervened, and there's testimony after testimony. God intervened in an awesome way in the lives of the Israelis, and the result of that has sparked some very powerful things.
Right. Well, if we think about it, these people full of faith. We've had a Rabbi and Mrs. Waldman on the program, and they moved to Hebron right after the 67 war.
In the midst of about 80,000 extremely hostile Muslims.
Moved right there, never left. Started a Hesed yeshiva there, a religious college, a Bible school. At the same time, or right after that, Daniela Weiss and the group went north, right outside of Shechem, Nablus today, and started a settlement there, which is the oldest one in Samaria. So the outgrowth of this miracle stirred people of faith in Israel to liberate, since God had liberated these lands that was the true biblical Israel. It motivated them to move there and reestablish this Jewish town.
Faith, the camp of faith, I call them. Now, John, they're building there, and we went and built also there. There is a exciting prophecy in Zechariah that actually speaks about that and the international response to it. Read that if you will.
Now, Zechariah wrote this over 2,500 years ago. Zechariah 1, I'll start in verse 18. Then I lifted up my eyes and looked, and behold, there were 4 horns. So I said to the angel who was speaking to me, what are these? And he answered me, these are the horns which have scattered Judah, Israel, and Jerusalem.
Now he means by that international powers.
Right.
Secular international powers.
Right. Starting with Assyria down the line. Right. All right. Then the Lord showed me 4 craftsmen, builders in the land.
Carpenters, masons.
And I said, what are these coming to do? And he said, these are the horns which have scattered Judah, the first group, so that no man lifts up his head. But these craftsmen have come to terrify them, to throw down the horns of the nations who had lifted up their horns against the land of Judah in order to scatter it.
One of your friends, John, the former Secretary of State, I can't recall his name, once made the open declaration that these craftsmen are the single most impediment.
James Baker,
the single most impediment to peace. I mean, can you imagine a carpenter, a mason, and a plumber being a threat to international peace? But that's what the Secretary of State, James Baker, said. Well, last week we joined those craftsmen, and we became craftsmen ourselves, doing the same thing. And Mrs. Rice was in the land while we were, and I truly hope and pray that she was terrified by that. So, John, you would say then that the response in the Israeli community to the 6-Day War was this settlement movement?
There's no doubt about it. That's when it all started. By 1968, believing Israelis, people of faith, were moving to the hills, empty hills of Judea and Samaria.
Absolutely.
They did not overtake people's houses. They moved to the empty hills that hadn't been populated since 2,600 years, since Nebuchadnezzar.
And they're continuing to do that. All right, now let's look at the Christian response to the Six-Day War. Let's just back up to the whole span in the 20th century. You know, the prevailing Christian theology prior to World War II and coming up to the state of Israel was that God was dead. Some of you are old enough to remember statements to that effect. With the establishment of the state of Israel in 1948, God is dead theology died, and there was evangelical revivals. We remember the great tent meetings of Oral Roberts and great meetings of Billy Graham and so on. Great evangelical movement. Now in '67, when this event that we're talking about, when that occurred, there came a powerful outpouring of God's Holy Spirit that just swept across the church. Generally referred to as the charismatic movement, but a tremendous revival and awakening in the church to the presence of God and worship and the gifts of the Holy Spirit. And now that leads us up to the present time of what we will call the Christian Zionists, people like ourselves that embrace the whole Bible and are engaged in fulfillment of everything that the Bible says. Just this last weekend, after I left Israel last Thursday with most of the group, but 4 of our people stayed in Jerusalem, and they joined with a group. Pastor Hagee from Texas had a group of about 1,000 there demonstrating against dividing Jerusalem. And
just 2 days ago in Jerusalem.
Yeah, and giving up any land. So our group was there. They were delighted that they were able to join with Pastor Hagee and his group, Christians United for Israel there. So Christians, Christians have become alive as a result of this watershed event in the Six-Day War.
Absolutely. As the Spirit of God was moving in people of faith in Israel, He was doing the exact same thing in the church, moving on people of faith, and the whole Christian Zionist movement butted out of that also.
And how did the United States government respond, John?
Well, unfortunately, and Ken and I are both veterans of the military, United States military, and it's my sad duty to report that since this tremendous miracle, this victory in the '67 war in Israel, Israel's victory, our government has been working diligently to nullify it. A decade later, President Jimmy Carter organized the Camp David Accords, where Sadat and Menachem Begin and Jimmy Carter, you see the picture on the screen, got together, and the idea of that was land for peace. In other words, Israel would give up land and still get no peace. And our government started giving Israel $3 billion a year in aid, and Egypt $2 billion a year in aid. And so this money has corrupted not only the leadership of Israel into accepting, of course, you don't get money without paying a price for it. And so this land for peace is the United States policy, and so brazen as the Secretary of State, she was over there leaning on the corrupt Israeli government to pull up these roadblocks so that the result will be Jews will die, and if there are Christians of faith there, they will get killed there too.
Let me inject something there too, John. A lot of people use the rationale of saying that, look, the Israeli leadership wants this peace thing. The Israeli leadership right now is extremely corrupt and have been corrupted by this money. And so they do whatever the United States wants, as long as the money keeps coming. And that is the power.
And they're relying, and we read some scriptures, they're relying on the United States for their protection. But the Bible shows that only God and God alone will protect Israel. And it's relying on the Gentile nation even the United States is foolhardy. The United States is really not a friend. They're giving money to initiate Americans' foreign policy, which really means to placate the Muslim oil to keep it coming in.
Secretary of State is over and over has declared, Secretary of State Rice, that she wants to start a huge Muslim city right square in the middle of the
right
Shamron,
near Shiloh.
Right near Shiloh, and so, but well, we thought we'd help her however we could, so we just built on to Kedemim. Instead,
listen, we have something going on that's of biblical proportions, and the United States' plan, and guys like Jimmy Carter, masquerading as Christians, just like so many American pastors that are blind to whatever God is doing. God could come and go, and they're singing a happy tune. They don't even notice it, because the emphasis of what God's doing in the world today, he's been doing on the hills of Judea and Samaria. He who scattered Israel has regathered Israel, and he's watching over them as a shepherd watches over his flock. And it's foolhardy to think that the United States and all that military power is going to prevail against what God is doing. It's just not true, Ken.
It's not true. Now, the impact of this event that we've been talking about, the 6-day war, this watershed event, is indeed the vision. Now, we want to think about Jesus and everything, everybody smiling and feeling good, but the effect of what God did in 67 is dividing people, defining and dividing people. Jesus spoke of that in John 3. We don't have time to read that tonight, but if you'll read John 3:17 and following, light has come in the world, and it has two effects. It either draws people or rejects
That's
them,
right.
or repels them. And God acting in 1967 has had the same effect. We have this camp of faith in Israel that's building, and they're going to prevail. We have Christian Zionists. We have apostate Christians. We have local pastor here that is advocating destruction of Israel, actually. We're advocating building. And the nations are preparing for Armageddon. Now, the question is tonight, which group do you find yourself in? We believe that God is moving, and as a result of that, it's time for us to declare ourselves and to stand up and become involved. We want to invite you to come out and join us in study at the Zamok Institute and worship at Fellowship Church. That's our program for tonight. Shalom.